Ethiopian Jews, the Jews from Ethiopia. Today, they are actually spoken of as proof positive that Israel can't be. How can Israel be racist? What are you talking about? You accuse Israel of racism towards Palestinians? That's audacious of you to say such a thing when in fact there are black Jews. How can we be racist? Well, I find that to be, incredibly offensive. Very, very offensive. And the reason why I find it so offensive is because it inverts reality altogether. To say that Israel had only great intentions and it saved Ethiopian Jews from, please. In fact, Israel did everything it could to prevent the immigration of Ethiopian Jews. So what do I mean by that? Well, we look at the historical record. Golda Meir, the Prime Minister of Israel, said famously, what do we need that headache for? We've got enough problems with the Arabs. We don't need to bring black Jews here. It'll just cause more problems. And we see this in the writings of the Israeli emissaries. Because it's not that Israel couldn't have brought black Jews to Israel before they came. At that time, Israel had full relations with the Ethiopian government. This is Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia. And he's accepting the certifications, the qualifications of Hanani No, who was Israel's ambassador to Ethiopia at that time. So they had full relations and quite close military ties, I might add, as well. But Hanani No, when we go through his writings, we see the missives that he sent back to the government, he actually said, we can't allow these Ethiopian Jews to even visit Israel. Not even to visit. Why? He says, if we do, it will raise the hopes of immigrating for thousands of primitive, illiterate, sick, oppressed people who will never have capacity for. Israel's ambassador to Ethiopia. So how did this work? So let's say you were, because as I said, Israel and Ethiopia had close ties at this time, and still do. Now, if an Ethiopian Christian wanted to visit Israel, Ethiopians in general are very religious. If you've ever traveled through Ethiopia, and actually the idea of Israel is really deeply embedded in their culture, even amongst Christians. It's not only amongst Ethiopian Jews. So it's no surprise that Ethiopian folks often want to visit Israel, to see Jerusalem, to see where the church is, and to go to the Jordan River and be baptized there. And so if an Ethiopian Christian family wanted to visit Israel, no problem. They would just go to the Israeli embassy in Addis Ababa, in the capital, and apply for a visa, and received it, no problems, no questions asked. However, if you were a Jewish citizen of Ethiopia, and you wanted just to visit Israel, and you asked for a visa, they would charge you $600 for it, okay? Which at the time was beyond the means of the vast majority of Ethiopians, Jewish, Christian, or otherwise. So in this way, they didn't allow Jews to even visit because they were afraid that they would overstay their visas, that they would want to stay and that they would stay, and they didn't want them to stay because they didn't want black Jews in Israel. Now, some people would say, well, what do you expect, David? You know what Israel did, how it brought those Ethiopian Jews to Israel. It sent planes into the African continent to retrieve them. They took these Hercules jets and they flew them all the way to Ethiopia, and they got these Ethiopian Jews on board and they brought them to Israel, and they've been living in Israel ever since. Now, there's truth to that. Of course, that's part of the historical record. In 1984, but why did it only happen in 1984? You think that only in 1984 did Israel have the ability to send jets around the world? In fact, over a decade earlier, Israel seemingly did the same thing. Took Hercules jet, sent it down to Ethiopia, loaded Ethiopians on board and brought them to Israel, but they didn't bring Ethiopian Jews. Didn't bring Ethiopian Christians either. They brought Ethiopian donkeys. In the early 70s, Israel actually spent $500,000 American dollars, of those dollars of that time. It spent this money in order to bring Ethiopian donkeys to Israel. Now, why would it do such a thing? It did so because at that time, this man who was essentially like a conservationist, like Thoreau of his time, or someone who was one of the leaders of Israel's ecological movement back in the day, and his vision was, this is what he said, we need to bring animals back to Israel. We need to look in the Bible, look in the Torah, look in the Talmud, and see which animals were mentioned there that used to live in the land of Israel. Then if they no longer live in the land of Israel, if they no longer live here, if they've already gone extinct, we need to find where else in the world they still exist, and then bring some of those animals back to the country. Because then we'll be able to say, Look, the land is filled with the animals of the Bible. So, just as the land and the flora and the fauna from the time of the Bible have been, are now once again flourishing, so too should the land be ruled by the people who ruled it in the time of the Bible. So, this was part of essentially a propaganda effort to convince people that the Zionist movement is legitimate. So, what does this mean? It means that over a decade before the Israeli government was willing to allow black Jews to step foot on the soil of Israel, they spent $500,000 to bring black donkeys to Israel, or the official term of the military operation, Operation African Wild Ass. Now, this is in the early 70s. By the mid-70s, in the United Nations, there's already increasing opposition to Zionism as a movement. People are thoroughly disgusted with Israel's actions, with its treatment of Palestinian people. They see 1967, the country expands, colonizes the West Bank, Gaza, Golan Heights, East Jerusalem, the Sinai Peninsula. And at this point, it's quite clear that Israel's territorial ambitions are far greater than, the original state that it was accorded by the United Nations. So the United Nations passes a resolution essentially saying that Zionism is a form of racism, that Israel ideology is racist towards non-Jews. So when this happens, this is Israel's ambassador to the UN at the time, Chaim Herzog, he criticizes this, and it's a source of shame for Jewish people around the world that the state associated with them is considered to be a racist state. And so some of these American Jews are motivated to try to overturn this idea, to change the perception of the Israeli state. And they go to Ethiopia with the intention of supporting Ethiopian immigration to Israel. Now, I don't mean to say that these activists, that none of them were motivated by anti-racist ideas. I'm certain that no small amount of these American Jews who made it, who fought for the rights of black Jews to immigrate to Israel, I'm sure many of them were motivated by anti-racist ideology, but it can't be, ignored that no small number of them were motivated by with the idea that they tried to change the perception of Israel, that they wanted Israel to be seen as a normal state, and they thought that if they encouraged black Jews to move to Israel, that they could then use them as a fig leaf and say, "What? Me racist?" And that's what they did. So these groups lobbied for the Israeli government to finally allow black Jews to move to Israel. And at this point, the government's like, oh, should we allow them in or shouldn't we allow them in? What should we do? How many of them? Are they Jewish? Are they really Jewish? Are they half Jewish? Are they 3/4 Jewish? I mean, really disgusting stuff. But the Ethiopian Jews themselves said, enough. We're not waiting anymore. We have every right to move to Israel. It's our birthright. As I said, Ethiopian culture, the idea of Israel is firmly embedded in Ethiopian culture, Jewish and Christian. So the Zionist idea was always part of the community's ethos. And once they decided that in the mid-'80s, or the early '80s, that they weren't going to wait any longer, whether the government wanted them in or not, they were going to move to Israel. And they started walking on foot. They started walking north and eventually reached Sudan. And there, at this point, they're in refugee camps. And thousands of Ethiopian Jews died there in refugee camps in Sudan and on the way there by the time that the Israeli government decided to let them in. I know of no other incident where this happened. When you look at the photographs of Ethiopian Jews being brought to Israel, these are the photographs that the Israeli government touts as like proof positive of its anti-racist cred, right? But the question you have to ask is, why are they in color? If you look, right? Because all the other Jewish communities around the world, whether they're from Europe or whether they're from Asia or whether, or from North Africa, the Arab countries, they all immigrated to Israel in the early 50s or late 40s, right? It's only the Ethiopian Jews, the black Jews, who were not allowed to move to the country until there was color photography. Not in 1948 when the state was established, but only in 1984 that these operations occurred to bring them to the country. Of course, there were Soviet Jews, but it was the Soviet government that didn't allow them to leave the country, as they didn't allow anyone to leave the country, Jewish, Christian, or otherwise. So in any case, this history is not secret, okay? Ethiopian Jews know about this, and they're mad about this. And they're sick and tired of it, frankly, because it never ended. True, they're now being held up as like a, as a fig leaf, as I said, to try to prove to the world that no, we aren't racist. But they're sick and tired of it because the racism never ended. Sure, they were allowed into the country, but they've always been second, third, or fourth class citizens. There's all kinds of ways we can measure that, but of course, the way perhaps we can see it visually expressed is in the streets. This is just from last month. Okay, we have Ethiopian Jews not only taking over the streets, but taking over the highways. This is actually the largest thoroughfare in Israel. This is the Ayalon Highway in downtown Tel Aviv. And people were sick and tired. Now, of course, there's all kinds of ways that racism is experienced in Israeli society. And they have all kinds of complaints. But the way that they, the crime that they feel is most grievous is the police brutality that they experience. And so, of course, I don't need to explain to African American folks in the United States what that looks like. But neither do we need to explain it to Ethiopian Jews, who just last month took over the highway in both directions. There's a monumental achievement. And they're taking over the streets, and you can just read their signs for yourselves, okay? It's in Hebrew, but I've translated it for your benefit. Shotrim rotzchim et beta Israel. Police are murdering Ethiopians. All right? Now, here's a classic example. This is one of the signs of the protesters in Hebrew. 14 mikrei retzach means 14 murders over 5 years, 0 indictments. What's he talking about? He's saying the last 5 years, Israeli police officers have shot and killed 14 Israeli citizens. And in every single one of those instances, the people that they killed were they were all people of color. They were either Palestinian citizens of Israel, or they were Arab Jews, or they were African Jews. 0 indictments. No police officer had to pay the price for those crimes. Yeah, it's obviously a story that I don't need to go into detail about here. You're all too familiar with what that means. But, you know, this is felt very deeply by the community, because if you talk to Ethiopian Jews in Israel, just pick any random person. I mean, if you're close enough to someone, you just say straight up, they'll tell you about their own family history. They'll tell you that it's very difficult to find a family where either they themselves or their brother or their uncle or their sister or their cousin did not suffer some form of police brutality. Everyone's got a story. You don't need to convince anyone to go out to the streets. Old, young, everyone knows what it means to feel that on your skin. And so there's a long list of Ethiopian folks who have been killed in very shady circumstances by police officers in recent years.